The old man in chair 7 had been crying for an hour, and nobody at Merit General would tell him why his surgery had been cancelled. Marley Pruitt knew why. She had pulled his account at 8 that morning, and the reason sat there in plain digits on her screen. A balance of $11,000 from a stay 2 years back. An automatic hold the new system placed on any patient who owed more than 10. A surgeon slot at noon that the hold had quietly erased. She was a billing clerk, not a nurse, not a doctor. Her job was to read the numbers and pass them along. She was not supposed to walk out from behind the financial services desk and kneel in front of a stranger and take his shaking hand. She did it anyway. What she did not know, kneeling there on the cold lobby tile in her grey cardigan, with her name badge turned the wrong way, was whose hand she was holding. She thought he was just a frightened old man the system had decided to forget. She had no idea that the building around them, the floors and the lights and the very desk she had left behind, had been built by him. She had no idea that he had once owned all of it, and that the reason he sat there forgotten was the same reason her own life had been grinding thin for 3 years. She would learn all of it. First, though, she had to decide what to do about a man who was about to lose a kidney to a billing code. His name was Otis Granger, and that morning he had walked into the hospital with a folded admission letter and a small canvas bag, expecting to be wheeled into an operating room by noon. Instead, a young woman at intake had typed his name, frowned at her screen, and told him there was a problem with his account that finance would have to clear. He had waited. He had moved from the intake window to the long row of vinyl chairs by the windows, and he had waited some more, and the noon slot had come and gone while a clerk somewhere refused to release him. Marley had been the clerk somewhere. She had seen the hold flag and the override request and the note from her supervisor that said the same thing it always said. Now, collect first. No exceptions on balances over 10,000. She had typed her acknowledgements and moved to the next account because that was the job. And the job was the only thing standing between her and the end of everything. 3 years earlier, she had been a married woman with a paid-off sedan and a husband who fixed transmissions for a living. Then the marriage had come apart the quiet way, not with shouting, but with a man who simply stopped coming home, and Marley had found herself with a 7-year-old son, a 1-bedroom apartment on Ridley Street, and a job that paid $16 an hour to tell sick people what they owed. Her son was named Devon. He was 9 now, gap-toothed and serious, and he kept a running list of every bird he had ever seen taped to the refrigerator. He thought his mother had the most important job in the world because she worked at a hospital and she had never once corrected him. $16 an hour did not cover Ridley Street, the lights, the bus pass, and a growing boy. It covered most of it. Most months, if nothing broke. Things broke. A tooth, a winter coat outgrown, a field trip with a fee she could not say no to without watching his face fall. She had a checking account that hovered near zero on the 20th of every month, and a glove compartment full of envelopes she opened only when she had to. And she had a car, a 14-year-old hatchback, with a cracked tail light and 190,000 miles, that her ex-husband had left behind like an afterthought. It started cold every morning. It got Dave onto school and her to the late shift and back. It was, she sometimes thought, the last thing she owned that was fully hers. So she understood holds. She understood balances that swallowed a person whole. She had spent 3 years on the wrong side of that desk, telling other people the things that had been told to her, and somewhere along the way she had stopped letting herself feel it, because feeling it did not pay Ridley Street. That morning, kneeling in front of Otis Granger, she felt it. He told her in the broken way of a proud man who has run out of pride that he did not understand. He had paid that old bill, he was sure of it, years ago. He had the letters somewhere, his son had handled it for a while, and then his son had stopped speaking to him, and the letters had stopped. And now here he was being told he could keep his money or keep his kidney, but not both. He said the surgeon had told him 2 weeks ago that another month of waiting could cost him the whole organ. He said he had nobody to call. Marley should have stood up and gone back to her desk. Instead, she asked him one question. She asked how much. He did not know. The intake woman had only said it was over 10. Marley did know. She had the number memorized from that morning, $11,040 and some cents. And she knew something else that the old man did not, something she was not supposed to say out loud in a lobby. She knew that almost half of that 11,000 was not even his. She had seen, in the line-by-line ledger that only billing clerks ever read, the duplicate charges and the phantom supply fees that the new system stacked onto old accounts like silt. She had been seeing them for a year and a half. She had stopped letting herself feel that too. She told him she would see what she could do. Then she went back behind the desk, and she did the thing that would unravel her whole careful, hungry life. She could not clear his hold. She did not have the authority, and the man who did, the man whose name appeared on every override denial, would never clear it for a stranger. The hold, though, released the moment the balance dropped below $10,000. She had watched it happen for other patients, the ones with a relative who could wire a partial payment, the ones with a credit card that had not yet maxed. Drop the number under 10 and the system stopped seeing a debt and started seeing a patient. It was a cruel little threshold, and she had cursed it 100 times, and now it was the only door she could find. She needed a little over $1,000 to push him under it. She had $211 in her checking account, and rent was due in 9 days. That night, she did not sleep. She sat at her kitchen table, with the bird list glowing on the refrigerator behind her, and she did the arithmetic she had been avoiding for years. There was nothing to sell. The television was the apartments. Her wedding ring had gone the first bad winter. The only thing she had that anyone would pay real money for was parked in the lot below her window with frost already creeping up its windshield. She found a man 2 neighborhoods over who bought old cars for cash, and on Saturday morning she drove the hatchback to him one last time. He walked around it once, kicked a tire out of habit, and offered her $1,300. She had hoped for more. She took it. She signed the title on the hood of his truck with a pen that barely wrote, and then she stood in a stranger's gravel lot holding 13 $100 bills and watched a younger man back her son's whole world out of the space and drive it away. She took the bus home. It took 2 transfers and an hour and 10 minutes, and she used the time to decide how she would explain it to Davin. She told him the car had finally gotten too sick to fix, which was almost true, and that they would ride the bus together like an adventure, and he had looked at her with those serious eyes and asked if the car had gone to a place where cars rest. She had said yes. He had nodded, satisfied, and added a hawk to his list. On Monday she walked into Merritt General with $1,200 folded into the inside pocket of her cardigan, and before she clocked in, she went to the cashier's window like any other person paying down a balance, and she made an anonymous payment of $1,041 against the account of Otis Granger. It dropped his balance to $9,999, $1 under the line. The system blinked, and the hold lifted, and somewhere a surgical coordinator got a clearance she would never think twice about. She did not tell the old man. She did not tell anyone. She clocked in at her desk and watched, on her own screen, the hold flag disappear from his account just before 9 in the morning, and a minute later she pulled up the next patient and the next number, and she let herself feel, for exactly 1 minute, that she had done a true thing in a place that had stopped allowing them. What she did not know was that the building had a long memory, and that the man she had just saved had spent 40 years teaching it to remember. Otis Granger had his surgery that Wednesday. It went well. The surgeon kept the kidney. And on Thursday, while Marlee was processing the day's denials, the old man asked a nurse a simple question that the nurse could not answer. He asked who had paid his bill. He had not paid it. His estranged son had not paid it. The hospital had no record of a name, only a cash payment logged at the cashier's window with a generic patient services receipt. He lay in his recovery bed and turned that over. A man who for most of his life had been the one writing the checks, now unable to find out who had written one for him. There was a thing the nurses and the clerks and even the surgeon did not fully grasp, because the building had changed hands on paper and most of them had been hired after. 41 years ago, Otis Granger had founded that hospital. Not a billion-dollar man, never that, but the son of a porter who had built a clinic on the east side of the city into a full community hospital with his own sweat and a stubborn refusal to turn anyone away at the door. For most of those years there had been a fund, a real one, money set aside, so that no patient who walked in scared would be turned away over a balance. He had called it the Open Door Fund, and he had guarded it like a church. 6 years ago, his health had wavered, and his son and a board he had let grow too strong had eased him into the role of chairman emeritus, which is a polished phrase for a man with a nameplate and no vote. They had brought in a new chief financial officer to modernize the place. His name was Brenton Kessler, and he was very good at his job if you measured the job in margins. Kessler had looked at that fund the way a man looks at money left on a table. He had not stolen it. Nothing so crude. He had restructured it. He had renamed it a community care reserve, capped it, and quietly rerouted its rules so that the automatic collection system came first and the fund came second, available only by an application process so slow that most patients gave up. He had installed a new billing engine, the one that stacked phantom fees and flagged the desperate, and he had built his bonuses on the difference. In 3 years, he had turned a hospital that broke even into a hospital that posted a profit. And the board had loved him for it, and Otis Granger had watched from a recovery bed in his own building the way he watched everything now from the outside. He did not know yet that the woman who had paid his bill worked 60 feet from where he lay. He only knew that someone with no reason to had reached into a system built to take and had taken something out and given it to him. He was old enough to know how rare that was. He decided he would find out who. Finding out was harder than it should have been, and the reason it was hard told its own story. The cashier's logs that would have named her had been anonymized by the same privacy settings Kessler had tightened, ostensibly to protect patients, in practice to keep the right hand from ever learning what the left was doing. So Otis did the old-fashioned thing. When he was discharged, he did not go home, he came back. He sat in the lobby, in chair 7, the same chair, for 3 afternoons in a row, in an ordinary brown coat, watching the financial services desk, waiting to see if anyone there would do anything that the rest of the building would not. On the 3rd afternoon, he saw it. He watched a clerk in a grey cardigan, a small tired woman with a name badge always turned the wrong way, leave her desk to walk an elderly patient through a payment plan with a patient's nobody was paying her for. He watched her slide a box of tissues across the counter to a young father whose hands were shaking. He watched her, at the end of her shift, count the change in her own coat pocket and add $4 to a stranger's vending machine card so the woman's husband could get a coffee on the surgical floor. And he watched her walk out into the cold and stand at a bus stop because she had no car, and ride away. He asked one nurse her name. The nurse said it was Marley from billing. Otis Granger sat in the lobby a long while after she had gone, and then he made 2 phone calls. The first was to a lawyer he had not used in 6 years. The second was to a man at the state who handled hospital licensing, an old acquaintance, and that call lasted 40 minutes and was not warm. He did not announce himself. That was the part that mattered, the part that would matter most at the end. He could have walked up to Marley Pruitt that afternoon, told her who he was, written her a check, and made the whole thing into the small sweet story everyone would have expected. He did not, because by then he understood that her $1,041 was not the wound. It was the place where the wound showed through. A hospital he had built so that no scared person would be turned away had become a hospital where the only person turning toward the scared was a clerk who had to sell her car to do it. Kessler had not just taken his fund. Kessler had taken the building's heart and replaced it with a meter, and a check to Marley would fix exactly 1 clerk's month and change nothing. So he went quiet, and he went to work in the patient way of a man who had built the whole thing once and knew where every wall stud was. And while he worked, Marley's life got harder, because that is how these things go before they get better. The rent on Ridley Street came due, and the $1,200 she had not spent on the old man was already gone, swallowed by the same arithmetic that swallowed everything. Without the car, the bus ate 2 hours of every day, hours she used to spend with Davin. He started getting to school late because the morning transfer ran when it felt like running. The school sent a note. She rode the bus to a meeting she could not afford to miss work for and sat across from a counsellor who used the word truancy, and Marley, who had sold the last thing she owned to keep a stranger's kidney, sat very straight and did not raise her voice and explained about the bus. She did not need to raise her voice. She had stopped expecting raised voices to help. Then the thing happened that she had been bracing for without knowing it. Brenton Kessler ran an audit. He ran them quarterly. Sweeps of the collection numbers looking for leakage. his word for any dollar a patient owed that the building had failed to extract. And the anonymous payment on the Granger account caught his eye because it had dropped a balance to exactly $1 under the collection threshold, and Brenton Kessler had not built his career by ignoring a number that landed exactly $1 under a threshold. He pulled the cashier log. He saw the timestamp, just before 9 on a Monday. He cross-referenced the badging records. He found one clerk who had badged in a few minutes earlier that morning and sat at the cashier-adjacent terminal, and her name was Marley Pruitt. He called her into his office late on a Thursday afternoon. His office was on the top floor, glass on two sides. The city spread out below like something he owned. He did not raise his voice either. He told her he had noticed an irregularity. He asked her in the smooth way of a man who already knows the answer, whether she had made a personal payment on a patient's account. Marley, who did not lie well and had never seen a reason to learn, said yes, she had. He told her that was a serious violation. Patient accounts were not to be touched by employees. It created liability. It created, he said, the appearance of impropriety, as though a clerk paying down a stranger's bill out of her own thin pocket were a kind of theft. He did not ask why she had done it. He did not ask where a $16 an hour clerk had found $1,000. Why? He told her she was suspended without pay pending review, and that the review would likely end in termination, and he slid a paper across his wide, clean desk for her to sign, acknowledging that she had been informed. She asked him one question, the only one that mattered to her. She asked if the old man was all right. Kessler looked at her as though she had spoken in a language he did not bother to learn, and he said that the patient's outcome was not the issue. The issue was the integrity of the system. That was the lowest afternoon. She rode the bus home in the early dark with a cardboard box of her desk things on her lap, a coffee mug and a framed photo of Davon and the little potted plant that had somehow survived the fluorescent light, and she looked out the window at the lit-up shape of Merritt General going past the building she had given her last real possession to, the building that had just put her out. She thought about the rent. She thought about the bus pass. She could not renew. She thought about the note from the school. And for the first time in 3 years of holding it together with envelopes and arithmetic, she let herself, on a public bus, with strangers all around, cry, quietly, with her face turned to the dark glass. What she did not know that night was that 2 miles away, an old man in a brown coat had spent the entire week assembling the very thing that her suspension was about to set on fire. Because here is what Otis Granger had been doing while Marley rode the bus and sat through the truancy meeting and got called to the top floor. He had not been writing a check. He had been reading. The lawyer he called had pulled the hospital's founding documents and the original trust that established the fund, the trust Otis himself had signed 40 years ago, the trust that Brenton Kessler had restructured but, it turned out, had never had the legal authority to dissolve. The fund still existed, it had simply been buried under a process. And the trust named as its sole surviving trustee with the power to enforce its terms, one Otis Granger, Chairman Emeritus, the man with the nameplate and no vote, who turned out to have 1 vote after all, the only one that counted where that money was concerned. And the old acquaintance at the state, the one who handled licensing, had been very interested to hear an allegation from the hospital's own founder that a community care fund, mandated by the hospital's non-profit charter, was being systematically withheld from the patients it was created to serve. That was not a board matter. That was a regulator matter. That could cost a hospital its non-profit status, its tax standing, the whole quiet engine of its profit. The state man had said he would need documentation. He would need to see the billing records, the denials, the phantom charges, the pattern. He would need someone inside who knew where the bodies were buried in the ledgers. Otis Granger knew exactly who knew where they were buried. He had watched her turn her badge the wrong way for 3 afternoons. She had been suspended now, though, walked out with a cardboard box, and a suspended clerk has no access to the system at all. Kessler, in firing her, had thought he was closing a door. He had no idea he had just told the one person who could open every door exactly which clerk to call. The call came one slow weekend morning to the apartment on Ridley Street while Marlee was teaching Davin to make pancakes because there was nothing else to do and nowhere to go. A man's voice, old and steady, asked if he was speaking to Marlee Pruitt, the woman from Financial Services. She said she did not work there anymore. The voice said he knew. The voice said that was, in fact, why he was calling. And then the voice said something that made her sit down at the kitchen table with flour on her hands. The voice said, "I believe you paid a bill for me." He told her his name was Otis. He told her he had been the frightened old man in the lobby that morning. And he told her that he was not calling to thank her, though he would do that too, but to ask her for help because he was trying to fix something much larger than one bill, and he could not do it without someone who understood what the numbers had been hiding. Marlee did not believe him. At first, a frightened old man from the lobby did not have a lawyer and a regulator on the line. Still, he asked her to come to an address downtown, and he sent a car, an actual car with an actual driver, to the curb on Ridley Street, and Davin pressed his face to the window and watched it idle there like a creature from his bird list. And because she had nothing left to lose and a son to feed, she went. The office downtown was small and full of boxes, the office of a lawyer who had clearly come out of a comfortable retirement to do this one thing. Otis Granger stood up when she came in, the same old man, steadier now, his colour back, in the same brown coat. He did not reach for his wallet. He reached out and took her hand the way she had taken his in the lobby, and he held it, and he said thank you, and his voice broke on it the way a strong man's voice breaks when it has been holding something a long time. He told her he had watched her for 3 days. He told her he knew what she had done with her car. He had asked the man who bought it. He knew the exact price. Then he showed her the documents. He showed her the trust with his signature on it. He showed her the charter that promised an open door. And he showed her, laid out across the lawyer's table, the things she had been seeing on her screen for 1.5 years and had taught herself not to feel, the phantom charges and the duplicate fees and the buried fund, the whole quiet machine Brenton Kessler had built on the backs of frightened people. And he asked her if she would be willing to tell the truth about it to a regulator on the record, with her name on it. He told her it might end her chance of ever working in a hospital billing office in that city again. He also told her that the Open Door Fund, the real one, still existed, and that he intended to bring it back, and that he would need someone honest to run it. She did not answer right away. She thought about Davin, and the rent, and the bus, and how careful she had learned to be. And then she thought about the old man from that first morning and the young father with the shaking hands and the woman whose husband needed $4 for a coffee and every account she had closed with a hold flag because the job was the job. She had spent 3 years not feeling it. She found she could not feel it anymore. She said yes, not in a speech. She just said she would tell what she knew because it was true and somebody ought to. What she gave them was not a feeling, it was a map. She had spent 18 months inside that billing system, and she remembered the way only a person who lives in a thing can remember exactly which fee codes the engine stacked and which accounts it flagged and how the override denials all traced back to one signature. She did not have access anymore, but she did not need access. She had carried the architecture of it out in her own head. She sat with a lawyer for 2 days and built him a document that any auditor could follow, a plain ledger of how a hospital had turned its open door into a turnstile, and she signed it. Then she did one more thing. She remembered that the system kept an immutable archive of every override request and denial, a log Kessler could not quietly edit because it had been built years ago on Otis Granger's own insistence. Back when he still ran the place and wanted a record no one could cook. She told the lawyer where it lived and who, among the few honest hands still left in that office, could be trusted to pull it. Kessler, for his part, was not asleep. When the state's request landed on the hospital's general counsel, he understood at once what kind of fight had come for him, and he was, as the building had learned to its sorrow, very good at his job. He moved to get ahead of it. He drafted a memo recasting the buried fund as a prudent reserve. He prepared to argue that the fired clerk was a disgruntled employee with a grievance, that her so-called payment had itself been the violation, that nothing she said could be trusted. He instructed his staff to begin pruning the override logs to clean up what he called the noise. He had foresight. He moved to protect what he had built. He did not know that the override archive he ordered pruned was the one log in the building he could not touch, sealed years ago by the founder's own hand. He did not know that the founder was not a nameplate in a recovery bed, but the sole trustee of the fund, with the legal standing to march into a board meeting and demand its restoration. And he did not know that the disgruntled clerk he planned to discredit had not been fired into silence, but fired into the one position from which she could see everything, and owed the building nothing. The reckoning came at the quarterly board meeting, in the long glass room on the top floor, 3 weeks before the new year. Brenton Kessler ran those meetings. He had a presentation ready, margins up, leakage down, the community care reserve described in 3 reassuring bullet points. He was midway through it when the door opened and Otis Granger walked in a pressed dark suit and not the brown coat, with his lawyer beside him and a thin folder in his hand, and took the empty chair at the head of the table, the chair that had been kept for the chairman emeritus as a courtesy nobody expected him to claim. He claimed it. He set the folder down. He did not raise his voice. He said he was invoking his standing as sole trustee of the founding fund, and he laid out, page by page, in front of the board that had eased him out, the man who had hollowed his life's work, exactly what had been done. The buried fund, the phantom charges, the pattern of denials. And then he laid down the override archive, the sealed one, the one Kessler had ordered pruned and could not, and beside it the plain ledger a fired clerk had built from memory, and the two matched line for line, and there was no version of the story in which they matched by accident. Kessler tried. He was good at his job. He said the clerk was disgruntled. Otis Granger said the clerk had sold her only car to pay a stranger's bill in the building Kessler was supposed to be running, and asked the board which of the two of them they thought had been protecting the hospital's mission. Kessler said the reserve had been managed prudently. The lawyer slid the trust across the table, with Kessler's own restructuring memo clipped to it, and the regulator's letter clipped to that, and the room went quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when the people in it realize which way the wind has been blowing the whole time, and that they had better be on the right side of it by the time the door opens again. The board did not need long. A hospital that loses its non-profit standing loses everything, and the documentation in front of them made that outcome a live and immediate thing. By the end of the afternoon, Brenton Kessler was no longer the chief financial officer of Merritt General Hospital. He was not led out in handcuffs. There was no spectacle. He gathered his own things into his own box the way Marley had 3 weeks before, and rode the same elevator down, and the building he had run for 3 years simply closed over the space where he had been, the way water closes over a stone. The fund was ordered, restored in full, its rules rewritten back to the founder's plain language. No patient sent away at the door because of what they owed. Ever. Marley was not in the room for that. She learned of it the way she had learned most things. From the outside, on a phone call. 2 days later, the old man came to Ridley Street himself, not in a scent car this time, just an old man and his lawyer and a folder, and he sat at her kitchen table under the bird list and told her what the board had done. And then he told her what he had come to ask. He told her the Open Door Fund needed a director, someone who knew the system from the inside, who knew exactly how a frightened person got turned away, because the whole point was to make sure they never were again. Someone who had proven, with the only proof that ever really counts, that she would spend her own to keep a stranger's door open. He said he could think of no one in the building more qualified, and he meant qualified in the truest sense, not credentialed but tested. He offered her the job. He named a salary that made her put her hand over her mouth. And then, because he was a careful old man who had once lost his own life's work to a man who knew the numbers, he told her the thing that mattered most to him. He told her he wanted her to run it because he trusted her and that he had stopped trusting people who only knew how to count. She took the job. She did not take the check he tried to write her. For the car, the one that would have paid her back the $1,300 three times over. She told him the car had gone to a place where cars rest and that she had not done it to be paid back, and that if he wanted to honor it, he could keep the door open instead. He looked at her a long moment, the way you look at someone who has just told you the truth, and he put the check away and he never offered it again. Some weeks later, a used car appeared in the lot below her window, paid for and titled in her name, with a note on the dash that said only that a fund director could not run the city on 2 bus transfers, and she understood that this was a different thing than being paid back, and she let it stand. Davin added a cardinal to his list the morning the new car appeared, a real one, red on the bare branch outside the window, and he announced it the way he announced everything, as the most important news in the world. Marley wrote it down for him because her hands were full of his backpack and his lunch, and then she drove her son to school herself for the first time in months, on time, the heater working, the radio low, and she did not cry, though she could have. She had done enough of that on buses. She ran the fund out of a small office on the 2nd floor of Merritt General, not the glass tower on top, and that suited her. People came to her now the way they used to come to her desk, scared, holding letters, sure they were about to be turned away, and she got to be the one who told them they were not. She kept the rules in plain language taped to her wall where the bird list hung at home. No patient turned away over a balance. She hired, as her first assistant, the young father with the shaking hands, who turned out to be steadier than anyone had given him credit for once someone stopped frightening him. She still turned her badge the wrong way out of habit, and now it said Director on it, and she still did not bother to fix it. Otis Granger came by once a week in the brown coat, again his colour good, and sat in her small office and drank the bad lobby coffee and told her about the early years, the porter's son building a clinic on the east side, the first open door. He had gotten his son to speak to him again, somewhere in all of it, the way a near thing will sometimes shake a family back toward each other, and he told her about that too. He told her once that he had spent 40 years building a place to make sure no scared person was ever turned away, and had lived long enough to watch it get taken, and had been turned away himself at his own front door by his own machine, and that the only reason he had lived to fix it was that one clerk had refused to look at him as a number. He said the building kept a long memory, and that for a while there it had forgotten, and that she had been the part of it that remembered. He died 3 winters later, quietly in the hospital he had built, in a room with the door open and no balance on his account, and he left the Open Door Fund a sum of money that meant it would never again depend on the mercy of a board. Marley was there at the end. She held his hand the way she had in the lobby that first morning, and his was the one shaking now. And she did not let go until it stopped. On the morning of his service, the lobby of Merritt General was full of people, and most of them did not know each other, and most of them were there because at some point a door had stayed open when it should have closed, and they had traced the reason back to a fund, and from the fund to a quiet woman in a grey cardigan who ran it. Marley stood near chair 7, where it had all begun, with Davon beside her, taller now, his list of birds longer, and she watched the room fill, and she thought about a 14-year-old hatchback with a cracked taillight that had carried her son to school for years and then carried a stranger's surgery, and she found she did not miss it at all. She kept one thing of the old man's after the service, not the trust, not the fund papers, none of the documents that had won it. She kept the brown coat. She hung it on the back of her office door, where every scared person who came in to be told they would not be turned away could see it without knowing what it was, and on cold mornings she wore it across the lobby, a director in a porter's son's coat, keeping a door open in a building that had finally, fully remembered what it was for. If you have ever been the one who quietly carried more than your share, the one nobody saw counting the change in your own pocket, you already know how this kind of thing comes back around when you least expect it, and you might know someone who needs to hear that it does. Stories like this one are why we keep telling them, and there is another waiting for you next of a person overlooked who turned out to be the one who held the whole thing up.